Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Wine Words. I am Michelle, and of course is Diana.
Hello.
I've been saying that for so long that if I don't say it precisely the same way every single time, it just doesn't feel right. And this is, of course, our May Book of the Month episode. So, first time joining us on a Book of the Month episode, which tonight we'll be discussing All That Is Mine I Carry With Me. We do spoilers for Book of the Month. So if you have not finished the book, please don't listen to it right now because we're getting into all of it and we'll ruin it for you. And I don't want to ruin this book because it was amazing. So save it and come back once you finished it. And of course, we have author William Landay with us to let us pick your brain. So thank you for making time for us tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So we're just chatting before we started. We actually, this is not completely off topic, but Diana binged, told me she binged Defending Jacob like in a day, and and her husband ended up sitting down. Like it started off like popping in and out, but by the end he was like sitting down, completely invested in it.
Oh, 100%. He was just like, "What's this show are you watching?" And I told him a little bit about it. He was like, "Okay." He watched it for a few minutes. And then he gets up and walks away. And then he came back and he's like, "No, I want to watch it with you." And then he had to go out to clean the pool. He's like, "Put it on pause while I go work on the pool. And then we'll come back and we'll finish it." So he got really invested in the show as well.
Well, I love hearing that. It's when the show came out, I think Apple TV Plus was a relatively new service.
Mm-hmm.
So I think even though it has big stars and was a really well-made show, it flew under the radar a little bit.
Yeah, I think so, because we resisted getting Apple Plus for a long time, but then we ended up getting it, and we really like that streaming service. And so now we're still going back into the, I don't even want to say archives because it wasn't really that long ago that the show came out. So
Right.
we're going back and watching some of the past movies and television shows. And that was one that was like, "Ooh, this is nice." We got really into it, as you know, binging it within a day.
Yeah, we're all in this sort of transitional period where we're figuring out which of these new services we're attached to, and we're experimenting. It all seems very up for grabs right now. There's kind of a land rush happening. So we'll see
Yeah.
which of these streaming services is still standing when the land rush is over.
Yeah, it's a very interesting quagmire, especially when you start getting into residuals and the rights for writers and actors and all of that. There's a lot that still needs to be figured out.
For sure.
So, and of course, tonight, that's like the first tangent of the night. We are here to talk about All That Is Mine I Carry With Me. And Phil's voice, book one, from Phil's perspective, you captured that voice so beautifully that I didn't even realize that it was the story. I legitimately thought it was an author's note by you explaining the backstory behind the novel. And I thought, oh, wow, he's like including some of the interviews that he did. That's really interesting. And I didn't even realize that I was reading the actual book until about halfway through book one. And I was like, oh, I was like about to Google Jane Larkin and do all the research on the case and see what happened. How did you approach opening book? And I feel like you did that.
Yeah, I'll let you in on a little secret, which is that the name of that narrator character, and that for readers who maybe some will be listening who have not read it, the novel opens with a narrator who is himself a novelist. And until the last edit, the name of that character was Bill Landay. And so we changed it at the end only because it was causing more confusion for readers than we thought was worth it. And of course, the reason to posit a character like that is because writing truly and honestly from your own perspective gives the book a sense of authenticity and realness. And that's what I was shooting for. this is a book that followed up a very big book in Defending Jacob, but before Defending Jacob, I hadn't had a big book. And so it was a real question of how to follow up a book like that. And I wanted to, in some ways, turn to the reader and break that fourth wall and address the reader directly, and say, this is me. And I think that in a information environment that we all live in now, and that novel readers come to us from, it's important that you convey a sense of realness, of authenticity, because there's so much bad information out there, so much misinformation out there, that we have all learned to be a little cynical. We've all learned to distrust information that comes to us. And that, I think, affects novel readers. Henry James said that the skill of novel reading was about suspending disbelief. And we are all taught now not to suspend disbelief. And that's in addition to the difficulty of simply sustaining focus for the length of a novel in an environment that, where the device you may be reading on is beeping and calling you to other apps constantly. So one way to combat that is to connect directly with the reader, and to not necessarily speak in the same language that might have worked for novel readers 50 or 100 years ago, but that meets the modern reader where she is, in a very distracting and noisy environment.
I love that. And I also think one other, not trick, but one other factor that you included to kind of lended that air of authenticity throughout the novel was to include the year in the dates. And that little thing, just instead of it being, October 15th, it was October 15th, 2017. It was so specific. It just made it feel like that much more, I can go Google that news article and find it online, kind of thing. So that was
Right.
one more thing that I think pulled me even more into feeling like this was a real story.
Right. And I think that's a common feeling now, where, a lot of stories come to you and you don't know what you can believe and what you can't believe. And in some ways that is a problem for novelists and novel readers, as I say, but in some ways, maybe it's an opportunity. You can play in that space where readers don't necessarily know if they can believe this story. They don't know if it's true or not true. And that sense that it might be true, that this might be real, lends a little tingle to the story. And I didn't want this book to sound like the book that readers were going to consume before it and after it. I wanted it to feel different, feel new, feel fresh, and feel a little challenging. And that's part of it, is to sort of play in that space between fiction and reality.
And just switching over to the writing approach, there was one thing that I noticed in books 1 and 2, because of course the book is broken down into 4 books, told through different voices, that books 1 and 2 used quotation marks to show dialogue, and books 3 and 4 did not. There were no quotation marks when characters were speaking. And of course, and again, spoiler alert for anyone who has not read the book, looking back, when you're done, or at least when I look back at the novel, when I finished it, I realized, and you even told us at one point exactly what it was, but I didn't pick up on it at the time, that those two were the stories within the stories. Those were the fiction, and then the books 3 and 4 was what was actually happening. Was that the reasoning behind choosing to include the quotation marks and not, or was there another decision behind that?
Well, I think generally the idea is that this is a book that is presented to the reader in pieces. It's a puzzle, and you're given the pieces, and the reader is invited or challenged to put the pieces together. There's a lot of connections that aren't made for the reader, and the reader is allowed to construct the story for herself. And that, to me, is a compelling experience for the reader, more so than having everything spoon-fed to her. So as far as the different grammar for each of those stories, these are stories that are told from different points of view. And I wanted to be sure that that each voice was truly distinct, and not just in terms of the tone or the sound of that voice. I wanted the pages even to look different. I wanted the pages to be visually distinct. One of the lessons I learned from defending Jacob was that there are limits to how much you can rely on book design in terms of cueing the reader visually as to who is speaking. In defending Jacob, there are passages that are told that are set in a grand jury, and they are presented in the book in the format of a grand jury transcript. And in the printed book, there's a special font that those passages are set in to make it visually look like a transcript format, so that after the first time the reader has seen this and the narrator has explained, we're now in a grand jury proceeding, Andy Barber is testifying in front of this lawyer and these grand jurors. After that, I was able to simply present that grand jury transcript format, and I no longer felt the need to explain to readers that now we're back in the grand jury room, back in this framing device that book used. Just seeing that format was enough to cue them that we were back into that space. What I didn't realize is that ebook readers can't reproduce changing font faces like that. So people who read Defending Jacob as an ebook didn't get the benefit of that visual cue and of the different font to let them know that we were back in the grand jury room. Had I known that I wasn't going to be able to rely on the book design to put the reader in the proper time and place, I would have, of course, in the narration, made it more clear. So in this case, I wanted to be, I wanted to try the same thing, giving the reader a visual cue that this was a different speaker with a different sound of her voice, and even a different look to the way she writes, a different syntax, a different grammar, without relying on book design. And so that means you have to fiddle with the grammar a little bit. You have to make these stylistic choices. And that was part of my thinking as far as that. I wanted each narrator not only to have her own voice, but to have her own syntax, and to have her pages look visually different, because part of the reading experience isn't just the way the words sound. As a reader turns the pages, it's a visual experience first. You see the page, and then as a reader, you bring your skill to pulling those words up off the page and performing the story for yourself in your own head. But the first flash that you see of that page is visual. And for those pages to look different for each narrator is another level of distinguishing one voice from another. That at least was the plan. Whether it succeeds or not is up to you as a reader.
I am absolutely fascinated by all of that. That blew my mind that typeface, you can get that in an ebook. I never never thought about that. And
I'm a little amazed by that too, because when you think about it, an ebook is really just a very long web page, and changing typefaces and different layouts, reproducing complex book design really isn't all that challenging. Anyone who has been on the web for 2 minutes knows that the design of web pages can be can reproduce almost any effect at this point. It's a little bit surprising that the book design has not penetrated the ebook world. Every ebook more or less looks the same, and more or less looks very simple in terms of design. And that seems to me to be a missed opportunity. It seems to be the technology lagging far behind what the devices themselves are capable of.
so I'm currently checking out my own book on Kindle to see because I have letters in mine, and I'm like, I never even thought that was a thing, because I have letters in between my chapters, and I never knew that and never even thought that was a thing. So now this is something I learned absolutely new.
It may have to do with, you can choose whether you want a serif font or a sans serif font, and you can fiddle with it a little bit. And that may have to do with why publishers can't determine what the page looks like. If publishers could lock their pages into certain fonts and certain presentations, that would limit the user's ability to change font faces and font sizes and so on. So that may be the design decision behind it. But from a publisher's or a author's point of view, it's a limitation for sure.
Sorry, I just wanted to say before we move off of this point, you just made me think of audiobooks as well. They obviously there is no font to see, and so there would be no way to telegraph to the reader that you're switching back to that transcript style. And it just made me think, in so many ways, audiobooks help enrich the story, the help of the narrators who are, of course, reading it. But that's also something that I didn't necessarily consider, that could also be something that a reader is losing through an audiobook in some cases.
For sure. In fact, it's very, we've all had the experience of good or bad narrators making or breaking an audiobook. It really does rely on the skill of the audiobook reader. But it's important to remember that books are not written to be read out loud. In this case, for example, one of the stylistic choices that I made is that there's a lot of pages where the dialogue is bare. And, there's not a lot of he said, comma, she said, comma. So there's not a lot of ways for the audiobook reader to cue the audience as to who is speaking. So really the only way to render those long pages of dialogue is to do it in different voices, which is a very tricky thing, because in this case, you have a book that has 4 different narrators speaking, and you have dialogue embedded within that voice. So you have the voice of the narrator, and within that narrator's voice, you have to try and mimic the register of all of these different characters who are speaking in dialogue. So it's a very tricky book to be read for audio. In fact, I thought, to push this line of my own presence within the book, I thought if there was going to be a narrator named Bill Landay, then that section of the book should be read by me. But when I looked at the challenge of performing a book like this, I knew immediately that I didn't have the chops to do it. This required a professional. So I bailed on that. But it just seemed like that would be another neat way to push that line of reality and how far you can go.
Now I need to listen to the audiobook, because I'm very curious to see how they did that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's a very hard book. The one thing I did insist on was that there be 4 different narrators, because there are 4 different narrative voices, and I didn't think that one reader could possibly capture the 4 different voices that are speaking. So they were kind enough to hire a narrator whose voice was appropriate to each of those books, so that those shifting tones are really captured in a nice way. And in a way, it's closer to reality. It's neat to actually hear those voices change. In the book, there's a little bit of a adjustment period as you move from one voice to another. It's disorienting in a way, and you have to figure out, who is this new speaker, what's going on, what is this transition that happened pretty abruptly. And so the audiobook does have the advantage of a new voice stepping on stage, as it were.
I was just going to shift gears and talk about your law experience. As somebody who also has some law experience before going into writing, I want to talk. I always get fascinated about talking about moving from the legal world over to the literary world. I mean, for me, it was just going from a paralegal to being a historical fiction author, but you went from being a DA or assistant DA to being a mystery author. And so I just want to kind of talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, it's I mean, in terms of writing style, as you would know, having been a paralegal, there's a lot of unlearning to do. Legal writing is very meticulous, and it's almost scientific in the way that each sentence needs to be cited and proven, and logical and rigorous. And it took me a long time to adjust to the freer style of fiction. You need to unlearn a lot of what you learn as a lawyer. On the other hand, having been a lawyer gave me at least my subject. I don't think it's any coincidence that there are lots of former lawyers who write, and part of the reason for that, at least, is that law is just a dramatic field. It's not in ordinary practice for most lawyers who are doing real estate closings and trusts and estates and things. But for courtroom lawyers, courtroom is a natural stage. It has built-in conflict. Obviously, the entire legal system is built on conflict. And it also, a trial has a natural dramatic structure. It's a kind of play, and it goes in a set form and procedure, and it simply is stagey in a way that is very easy for novelists to glom onto. I don't think it's any accident that there's 1,000,001 legal shows that are built around a trial format, and also built around the investigation of crimes, because it's just sort of a template that is infinitely adaptable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do have to say, though, when it comes, because I did estate planning, and there's still drama. There's still drama in that.
Well, I have no doubt. I mean, I've always thought that, I don't think that crime itself in reality is all that interesting. I don't think that criminals themselves are interesting. I don't think that most crimes that go through the ordinary district courts are interesting. They tend to fall into patterns. They tend to be repetitive and cliched in a lot of ways. And I don't find violence itself especially interesting without more. What makes crime stories interesting to non-criminals and to a general readership is what they tell us about ourselves. It's just a prism to talk about relationships. And in my case, my books tend to revolve around family relationships, and that is the advantage of crime novels to me, is that they dramatize a lot of things that are usually left unspoken, and that dramatic aspect of those stories is where their real value lies. The crime stories that last, the crime stories that stick with you, are the ones that resonate with other larger issues. A guy who robs a bank is not interesting. A guy who robs a bank to save his sick child is interesting. So it's the human aspect of these stories and the relationships that gives them their real value. And I would think actually that estate law would be very interesting, because that is where family relationships are quantified. That is where you have to lay your cards on the table of, which child, which which person in your family gets what. And that is where, that's where things become specific, and it's just a dramatic situation.
Yeah, and it was funny because the attorney that I worked for used to be a district attorney for a lot of LA County, and this was his pseudo retirement gig, because he decided it was too much for him in LA, so he decided to just kind of give it all up and do estate planning. He was doing a lot of that, and it was relaxing for him for a while, and then society kind of took a turn, and everybody's fighting with everybody now over money. And he was just like, now, like when I said I was leaving to go write, he was like, I think it's a good time for me to leave as well. I'm done with the drama. And because there's a lot of courtroom drama, I would hear some of the stories that he would say about what he did. And he was a DA in the 80s and 90s in LA.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's telling that he went from being a DA in LA to in the 80s and 90s to estate law, and he found estate law more trying. It would be a little bit like divorce law, I would think, which I assume is very interesting, because you are seeing people in extremis. You're seeing them at the worst possible moment, when they're under the most stress. And I'm sure it's not pleasant to go through, but it must be dramatic.
And what you said about the writing styles and having to unlearn a lot of that writing, and how meticulous, and how that comment just made me think of, in Jeff's story, what his actual title was, but the person reading out what the lawsuit was, how succinctly it broke down the entire family relationship and situation into 3 sentences. That legal writing broke down the entire, what was it, 15 or 18 years into just 3 very simple sentences.
Yeah, and that is how the law works. I mean, you can't. What happens in the novel is that they bring a civil suit against their father for the damage that they've incurred, for what they believe is him murdering their mom. And what's interesting is that every injury is not compensable. You have to figure out what particular torts your injury fits into. And there are a roll call of torts that your situation might fit. And so that's how you have to do it. And it's just interesting that these definitions exist for all of the little injuries that we might have, and not so little. And it puts into perspective how repetitive these situations are, and how the injuries that seem new and novel to us have been around for hundreds of years, long enough that these particular torts defining them could exist and have a long history for each of them. So it's the interesting aspect of the law, is that's where our injuries and our the things we do to each other are defined and settled. Again, that's why it's such a natural playground for novelists and storytellers.
And Tortlaw, that goes back, if I remember correctly, doesn't it go back to like the 16th, 15th or 16th century, some of that stuff?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's still laws that we go by in this country that were developed in England way back in the day.
Yes. Yeah. Our entire legal system is descended from the English legal system for sure. In fact, it's interesting. It's the reason we call it a court is that at one point the king himself would travel around, and people would come to him and ask for justice, to ask him to resolve disputes in one way or another. And it was literally the royal court traveling around. And the people who traveled with him and would advise people who were coming to seek redress from the king, those were the original lawyers. And they were simply people who had seen the process over and over again and learned to advise people. And that's the beginning. This system has been around for a very long time.
Now, speaking of the court being a natural stage and it's a performance, what went into creating Dan's character? Because it was really interesting and it was fun to read the scenes where he was doing his thing. He was cross-examining and examining witnesses, and that was such an interesting scene to be able to see him in his kind of natural setting and doing the thing that he was a very good lawyer. How did you approach creating him in the courtroom and then also at home playing the worried husband?
Yeah, I don't know that there's any one thing. A lot of what these characters become and what the story becomes happens as you're working. I do think that in some ways this book is a mirror image of Defending Jacob, which is of course about parents looking down at their children and wondering what's going on in their kids' heads and what their kids are capable of. This in some ways is about kids looking up at their parents and wondering what they're capable of and what their inner secrets and flaws might be. And in some ways too, Dan is a mirror image of Andy Barber, who was the protagonist of Defending Jacob and who was a virtuous lawyer. Maybe not quite Atticus Finch. He had his flaws too and his secrets, but he was genuinely a good man. And in some ways, I thought it was an interesting response to that, or follow up to that, to have a lawyer who wasn't necessarily likable or admirable, and to see where that might lead. And also to have a father who isn't necessarily admirable or likable, and what situations or emotions that opens up for his children. We've all had the experience of growing up and coming to meet our parents as fellow adults and realizing their flaws in a way that maybe we didn't think about so much when we were little kids. And that's part of what this book is about. So presenting these kids with a dad who has very real flaws just makes for a richer, dramatic situation. I mean, the other thing, of course, is that, just as a practical matter, the crime he's suspected of is murdering his wife. I suppose it would have been interesting in a suspenseful, thrillerish sort of way to posit a saintly husband suspected of killing his wife, but it would have been a bigger leap for the reader. It was important for this book to work at all, for the reader to think, okay, that's at least credible. It's at least within the realm of possibility that a guy with this temperament could at least be capable of what he's accused of. So I think that all kind of goes into it. But of course, once you start writing, the book and the characters kind of morph and evolve in ways that aren't necessarily calculated. So it's interesting. A book comes to a reader as a finished product, as an object, and you read it, and there's kind of a sense of inevitability because the words are all laid down. They're in the pages before you even get to them, and you know that from page one. But as a writer, during the writing, it's really more about the journey of getting to the last page. It's a performance in real time, and you don't necessarily know where the story is going. And so for the writer, a book isn't so much an object or a finished product. It's a process. It's a journey, and what the reader experiences is really just recapitulating what the writer has gone through to get there, minus a lot of the false starts and bad days. So all of those things, I think, contribute to having a complex character at the center of this story. I like to think that all the characters are complex and idiosyncratic in their ways, because that's how people are. All people are strange and unique and have their little quirks. And all families are a jumble of these different temperaments. Anyone who's, sat at a Thanksgiving dinner with a bunch of people and wondered how on earth they could be related to them knows that sometimes families aren't all alike, and this family contains different personalities, and I think that they're all distinct and memorable in their way, and there's no saints among them, certainly, but they all have their good and bad qualities, just as people do.
So, and of course, I loved. I mean, up until literally the last few pages, do you realize, it was always going back, did he, didn't he? And did you know always how it was going to end, or were there drafts where it ended up a different way?
You think but then it changes as you go along. And no, I had other endings in mind. I went through several possibilities. It's a difficult book to end in some ways, because this is a book about doubt. It's about not knowing. And for the most part, it's a book about a cold case, an unsolved case. And so how do you end a book like that, a book that's about uncertainty, about the inability to really know what's going on in another person's head, and even to know what is fact and what is fiction? How do you end a book like that in a way that's dramatically satisfying and gives the reader a sense of closure, but is also true to that core idea of the book? This can't be, an episode of Law and Order where the suspect confesses from the stand, or some other smoking gun evidence comes up at the last moment to remove all doubt. This has to be true to the human experience of trying to figure out what happened when it's impossible to reach a 100% level of certainty. And that's true to the court process as well. If the last 20 or 30 years have taught us anything, it's that trials have an error rate that is higher than we may have liked to think. Humans are, even the best intentioned humans, are prone to mistakes of perception and recall and relating their story, telling their story. And jurors are humans as well, and they may evaluate evidence badly. So invariably, even a guilty verdict doesn't remove all doubt. And I think that we need to acknowledge that.
And it's funny that you mentioned closure, because there really isn't a ton of closure for the characters. I gave everyone a spoiler warning at the beginning, so I don't feel bad saying this. At the point that you find out that he really did do it, he's so far gone from Alzheimer's that he can't be that Miranda can't get any closure from him because he doesn't remember doing it. And he can't acknowledge that he did it because he doesn't remember doing it. But I love the one bit of closure that we did get was the little one-sided phone call that Miranda had with Jeff, where you found out like, oh, he did get his life together. He went to law school. He became a lawyer. And I love that in that world where there wasn't a lot of closure to get, we got that little flash of what happened in Jeff, and that he was able to move forward with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, well, thank you, first of all. I think that's an interesting twist on this whole thing is I thought it would, and first of all, book 4 was much longer at the beginning because I thought it was a big ask to suggest to the reader that you could have a suspect in a murder mystery who may not know himself whether he's guilty or not. That I thought that was a level of doubt that the readers would have a hard time buying. And so in earlier drafts of the novel, there were very long passages that narrated Dan's descent into dementia so that the reader wasn't asked to simply accept it as a fait accompli. And in the end, we concluded, my editors and I concluded, that wasn't necessary, that you could simply skip to Dan in his end state or near it, and that readers would accept that if it was rendered credibly. But it does present these interesting issues, both in terms of what his children can expect from him in terms of closure and justice, but also what the legal system could possibly make of someone like that. Can he be cleansed of guilt because of his dementia? If you were to convict him based on physical evidence of murdering someone 50 years before, but he literally has no memory of it, would it be, could you convict him at all? Probably not, because he probably wouldn't be competent to stand trial in the first place. But even if he were, what is it that you would be punishing? Is he the same man? Is he the same person simply because he occupies the same body? If his brain is gone, then who are you punishing, and what are you punishing him for? If the person that you're punishing has no sense of his own guilt, it's an interesting moral question, an interesting legal question. I think in terms of a legal question, it would actually be quite simple, because I don't think you could ever try him in that condition. But that, is a thought. Can we be cleansed of guilt by losing our memories? And maybe as children, as we grow up and our parents begin to fade in that way before dying, fade into dementia, maybe what we owe them is forgiveness and considering them to be different people. My mother has Alzheimer's, and she's simply not the same person anymore. And you go and you visit with her, but we have my siblings and I have no illusion that when we sit across the table from her that we're talking to our mother anymore. And that is an interesting and seemingly very typical, ubiquitous situation lately, as more and more of our population, for whatever reason, lives longer, and dementia seems to be a more common situation, and we all, or many of us, seem to be in the position of becoming caretakers for our parents. And that is, that's an experience that, in an earlier age would have been much less difficult, because the population simply wouldn't have lived that long. So that's, this is the way we live now, as Trollope said.
Well, I thought for sure once you get into book 4 and you realize what's going on and you realize that it's Anne's voice that you're reading, I thought for sure to say something. I mean, the way that you played out the end was awesome, because I thought, oh, he's gonna unknowingly talk about it or tell them that he did it, or during when Miranda was showing him all the pictures, have that moment where he said, oh, where he confesses without realizing he's confessing.
Right.
And even the ending, does she close the door and make him drink the medicine? Does she close the door and just talk to him? Like, you really can, this is a book that you can draw your own conclusions from. Do you think she gave him the medicine, or do you think she really did just talk to him?
I hesitate to say. I think I better not answer that one. I think that readers should make their own decisions, but I definitely do have an opinion.
This is the thing with Michele. So we have this long going debate where I love the open-ended books. I love the mystery at the end where you get to decide for yourself. And Michele can't stand them. And so,
not to say I don't like the ending. I love the ending, but I am a reader who I need to know what happened. I can decide, but I like knowing.
Yeah, you're on your own, pal. Sorry.
And of course, Michele would be the one to be like, okay, we cut the author here. I'm going to ask them point blank.
Well, that's really the whole point.
I actually
the whole reason behind the podcast.
I considered answering.
Almost got him, Michele. Almost got him.
Almost.
As a reader, do you prefer one type of ending over the other, or do you just go, oh, well, that's the fitting ending for this particular story?
I think that I prefer books that surprise me and that engage me. I think that one thing that is difficult for writers at this point is that we're relatively late in the life of this art form. Most every story has been told in one way or another. Readers know all the tricks, and it is, and yet readers insist on being surprised, including me when I read. And so I think that is the challenge. That's the circle you're trying to square, or the square you're trying to circle. I can never remember that phrase. I think that readers want to be surprised, and yet they don't want to feel cheated. They don't want to feel lied to. And I want the same thing too. I want a book that engages me and outsmarts me. And that is the best kind of read for me. But I think also that readers should, or the books should leave readers the space to think and the space to create the story for themselves a little bit and exist in it without having everything settled for them. If you leave so little for the reader to think about and to contemplate after she closes the book, I just don't think that that's a story that will land as deeply, that will stick the same way. So I think that, what you want is for the reader to be moved. And for that, I think you need to invite the reader in. And so that is, this is a book that in a lot of different ways, I think, does that. There's a lot of oxygen there for the reader to participate in assembling this book and thinking through this book and experiencing it in real time as an active participant and partner in performing the story for herself and creating it for herself. All books do that to some extent, of course, because all books rely on the reader to pull those words up off the page and perform the story for herself. But this book, I think, gives the reader a greater opportunity by leaving those open spaces for the reader to think about, what really happened, and how do you know? And that is, I hope, a memorable read because of that.
Well, it absolutely was. I loved this book. I literally, once I sat down to read, I would like walk over, grab a piece of pizza, and then walk back over to my little reading spot, and then go. And then at one point, I just gave up and stood next to the island with the book in one hand and pizza in the other, and that's how I had dinner one night. So it absolutely pulled me into the story.
Oh, I love that. I don't know what better compliment an author could get than pizza grease on the book.
Well, I from in book 2, reading from Jane's viewpoint, which is actually Miranda's viewpoint through Jane. When she was talking about how Dan approached books, I was like, oh my God, I'm the same way. I don't like when my books get dirty. Like, that's very unsettling.
I'm the same way too. My books are immaculate. I can't bring myself to trash them.
I can't. And Diane is very quiet right now.
I have a habit of reading them while I'm in the pool. They have gotten wet and they have been dropped.
They're made to be enjoyed.
Yes, my books have been written in. They have been. They get some hard truths.
That is great. I'm not saying that my way is the right way. I'm only saying that I don't know. This is how I am. It's probably better. I think you probably do experience a book differently if you are writing it and kind of engaging with the text in that way. I do wonder if that influences the actual experience of the story for you. You're clearly interacting with the object of a book in a different way, and maybe being less respectful of the physical object makes you have a closer experience with the non-physical story that you're engaging with.
Yeah, I did that. My father I got the habit from my dad. He wrote in all of his books in the margins, and I borrowed one of his books once, and he put a like highlighted something, and I was like, I can't believe this, and I immediately called him up. I was like, I can't believe that passage either. I'm right there with you on that.
And his note was from 50 years before.
Yeah.
Well, everyone, if you haven't read All That Is Mine I Carry With Me, please, even though we talked spoilers, you can always get your own copy and be like Diana and I, who love spoilers. We look up spoilers and then we enjoy the journey on how spoilers happened. So spoilers don't necessarily spoil anything for everyone, but you could always click on the link to our bookshop on bookshop.org in the show notes and order your own copy. Bookshop.org, of course, supports our wonderful writers. It supports the podcast, but most importantly, it supports all of the wonderful indie bookstores out there. And William, thank you so much for making time for us and letting us talk about this incredible book. It was so much fun to read, and we loved being able to talk about it with you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.